I know that Danny and you will talk about today, then maybe I would have had a bit more luck.
No, exactly. Well, it's good to hear. And our webinar is always about personal stories. So Ellie, feel free to digress later on. Danny, I've just shared the poll result there just to start with. So have you applied for any type of employment opportunity before? 71% of people on the webinar have applied for something in the past, okay? 29% have never applied for anything. So that's really good to know. Have you applied to anything this year? 64% have. So that's really good to know as well. Let's have a look here. How confident are you throughout the selection process? So one person's already got a job. Maybe let us know in the chat box what you've got. That's fantastic. Well done. 4% very confident. 50% somewhat confident in the process. 25% neutral. 7% not confident. 11% very uncomfortable with the process. So that's good to know. That is good to know. So there we go. So we've got students here who are applying and a mixture of those who maybe are just looking to apply as well. So that's a good place to start. Bear with me. This is where I've got to multitask and I struggle with that. So today, agenda, how to communicate, I'll tell you next, and you guys hopefully know, those of you who've been on panels before. We'll introduce our panelists and I'll hand over to Ellie and to Danny. Then Danny's going to go through, it's 2 slides really. There's 2 slides with a lot of information on in terms of what we want to talk about. I'll be trying to pick Danny's brains and ask him, as well as Ellie asking some questions. But do have a pen and paper ready, I would say, because there's going to be a lot of information that will help you. Remember, as a graduate, if you're going to apply in a few years, or an apprentice now, or internships, work experience, it's going to be really useful for you. The chat box, guys, is how you can use to communicate whenever we ask you to maybe do anything or give us some feedback. Use the chat box. The Q&A box is what you should use. You should be able to see it on your computer, either at the top or the bottom, if you want to ask a question. My preferred use of style of questioning is if you put your hand up, we'll let you speak, and we'll actually let you actually speak to Danny or Ellie or myself, and we can have a proper conversation, because that's quite nice, really. I haven't had many people do that over Easter, because I think people are chilling out a little bit more, but there we go. I'm the CEO and founder of Pathway. I'm doing a lot of these webinars, but also Ellie is doing quite a few of the webinars as well. Ellie, do you want to introduce yourself to the guys?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Ellie, and as Chris mentioned, then I can see quite a lot of familiar names. So you would have probably seen me on one of these webinars recently as well. So we're doing them daily and some other sessions. My role at Pathway CTM is Head of Employer Relations. So like I just mentioned, I spend a lot of my time talking and liaising with kind of the different employers that we work with, Danny being one of them at the co-op. And yeah, so it's kind of focusing on that partnership role and making sure that Pathway is really closely connected to all of our employers, so we can come on webinars like today and talk to you with the expertise of those employers who are actually hiring and in control of those roles that you all who are on the line today might be applying for in the future. So that's a big part of my role. So I can go into a little bit in terms of where I came from. So I come from more of a commercial background, started my life in advertising and worked my way up into different companies such as, Volkswagen and big companies you might have heard of. And now I really love what I'm doing, because it's great to talk to some of you students and find out, get a bit of a combination of working with the employers, which I'm kind of used to from previous roles, but also be able to talk and support students into roles with the experience that I've had from more of a teaching background. Although Chris, I know, has a bit more of a background in that area, but that's my story really, and how I've got to here today.
That's cool. And guys, has anyone been on one of Ellie's webinars? Do put in the chat box if you have. Put your name. It'd be good to know, and maybe what one it was. You've done cancer research recently. You've got some more coming up next week. Ellie, which one's been your favourite? What one are you looking forward to maybe in the future?
So in terms of my favourite so far, we had a really interesting session this Tuesday on diversity in the workplace with cancer research, like Chris just mentioned, and I loved that because I think it's really interesting, and I think I was just so overwhelmed by the responses from some of the students in terms of diversity and how mature some our students are in terms of approaching that topic, which is I really loved that, and a really responsive kind of crowd of students, which is great. But next week I've got a session with Sarah from, so she's a senior manager at Pret a Manger, and I'll be running a session with her on kind of mindfulness and the importance of well-being in a difficult time like we have at the moment. So I can see Ryan and Ebad, who have been on some of my other webinars, around the strengths profile, which I love. Ryan, thanks for that. And IBAD, yeah, it's brilliant. I've been doing some of the construction ones as well. So nice to see some familiar faces.
Brilliant. And Danny, sorted out your technical problems, hopefully. Fingers crossed. There we go.
Fingers crossed.
Danny, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience about your role and what you do at the Co-op? It'd be really great.
Yeah, of course. So sorry about this. My Wi-Fi seems to be horrendous at the moment. But yeah, so I work for the Co-op, work for the Co-op Group, and my role at the Co-op is to essentially lead and manage all of our recruitment for apprentices, for students, and community. So that very long-winded job title there, early careers, apprentice, and community recruitment need, is literally what I do. So what that means in layman's terms is, effectively, I lead on where our vacancies are in our business, how we go about recruiting and finding the right talent, for want of one of those words, and most importantly, and really very much deep rooted into the values of the Co-op, is how do we ensure that whatever we're doing is inclusive, is supportive of everybody in our community, which is where the community piece comes in. Not just in apprenticeships, but much broader than that, to help people into employment, wherever they may have kind of found themselves in that journey into the workplace as such.
Brilliant. So Danny's the right man for us for the assessment and selection, because it can get quite detailed. It's really important. And I guess, Danny, in terms of layman's terms, like, you're in HR in your company. What does assessment and selection really mean, if you were to say about it in layman's terms? What does it mean to you?
I think in one sentence, it's about finding the right person for the job. And what I mean by that is it's a two-way conversation. So that's a business perspective on understanding what we need in a job and finding what the right candidate is. So is there somebody out there who can help us fill that role? That might not be now. That might be in 5 or 6 years' time as well, when we look at apprenticeships. But it's also the other way around as well. So it's also an assessment by potentially yourselves as candidates on us as an employer to make sure that we're the right fit for you. And it's when those two things match is when you effectively get a hire, is what we would call it, or you make an offer to a candidate.
I really like that. And in terms of your confidence metrics, it's great, I always think, oh, look, this is a two-way conversation, like you just said. It's not just me seeing and them seeing if I'm good enough. It's actually, I'm going to see if they're good enough for me as well. It's quite nice to think about it like that, isn't it, Danny? Quite empowering.
It's important. It's really important, because if I apply for a position in a company and actually I'm not really that bothered about the organisation, I don't really buy into what they do, it doesn't really motivate me, then the chances are I'm probably going to leave within the first 2 years, which is probably not so good on you, because you won't be happy in the job that you're doing as a candidate, but most certainly isn't helpful for a business who's obviously spent a lot of time, effort and money in finding who they deem to be the right person, but actually under the surface wasn't necessarily the right thing for both parties all along.
No, absolutely. So here's one of our main slides in terms of detail. So right, I'll leave it to you, Danny, to crack on with where we want to go here.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. And I think for me, the one thing I would really encourage throughout the next kind of 20-25 minutes or so is to interact with us. If you've got questions, ping them into the chat box, ping them into the question box, just to really help us to understand and tailor what I'm going to be talking about to make it relevant, because I could just talk for England, to be honest, but actually the reality is it needs to be suitable and appropriate for yourselves. Whether you're thinking about applying to something and you've not quite started that journey, whether you're all the way through the journey and you've been offered, or actually whether you're somewhere in the middle of that application process. And today's session, I really want to focus on kind of three different kind of types of applications as such, or selection, but actually take you through the journey from finding the job all the way through to receiving the offer for the position. So we've got the first section today will be around finding the job, applying, where to search, what to think about. Second will be the meaty subject around what the selection process, and third would be around offer. And I want you to think about things, and what I'll be covering in light of is apprenticeships. So finding it and applying for an apprenticeship, finding and applying for a position, so a job, be that part-time, be that full-time, and also applying to university and finding the right course for you. That's the kind of the next step as such. So let's start from the top and work our way down. So finding a job, apprenticeship, or course. So this is really the start of the journey for both employers and for candidates. This is about really understanding what it actually is that you're going for. And if I'm being honest, this is probably the most important part of the process, albeit a lot of the content today is waiting to the selection part. But when you are looking for an opportunity, be that a job, be that an apprenticeship, or be that a university course, it is absolutely critical that you find the right course, the right job, the right apprenticeship for yourself. You will know when it's right for you because you'll get excited about it. You'll turn off the web page after reading an advert, and it'll just be in your mind, and you think, oh, that's what I want. That's what I want to do, and that'll give you that real buzz as to almost helping you understand what is right and what is not right for you. Now, there's ways and means about actually understanding what is and what isn't right for you, and that can be around things such as self-awareness, so understanding your strengths. And I know we've had Capfinity, and I referenced it last week, and I'll reference it again. Capfinity do some great work around strengths, and that'll help you understand who you really are, because that'll help you get a really clear picture as to what do you actually enjoy, therefore what is your strength. And the theory is what you enjoy is what you'll be good at. Naturally, there's lots of resources out there as well to help you find these opportunities. So first and foremost, use your careers departments at schools, colleges, universities. Use your network. So that's friends, that's families, that's people you may have met before and you want to reach out to. That's using tools such as LinkedIn. One of the things which a lot of people seem to forget about when looking for opportunities is hear it from the horse's mouth. So me as a company, I can put whatever I want to on my careers website. Great starting point. But the reality is sometimes, and this is definitely not the case for Co-op, but sometimes some organizations will shine and polish the experience of a colleague, and actually what they tell you in an advert or on the website is very different to the reality of the job. And that's really hard to decipher if you don't have any inside info. So using websites like Glassdoor, using websites like Rate My Placement, Rate My Apprenticeship will really give you that first-hand, honest, and kind of how to put this, personal experience that you can really delve into and understand what it is actually like to work in an organization. And that might just help you make that decision between 2 and 3 opportunities versus 10 and 20 opportunities that you might initially be looking for.
And it's really good, Danny, on that front. We were with the Financial Times yesterday on a webinar, and just using, impartial, because they're impartial, the Financial Times. They're not, they're not saying they've got to look after the Co-op or they've got to look after IBM or something like that. So read. And then, like Danny just said there, Rate My Apprenticeship, for example, they have awards every year and they have a certain ranking, for example, in terms of how good they are for apprenticeships. So using those websites is so important. And then remember, like a lot of students on Pathway, what they end up doing is doing webinars like this, coming to insight events and coming to find a different organization. If you're in year 12, you've got so much time to be able to do that and do more research at the moment. So I think, Danny, it often is the hardest part, isn't it? Actually finding out where do I go? Where do I go?
Yeah, I think for me as well, it's not just about reading and looking online and doing your secondary research as such. It's a big part of understanding what is the right thing for you, be that your second job, be that your 5th job, be that your first job, is experiences. So whatever you can do to gain experiences, to really get that first-hand real flavor as to an organization, will help you learn so much about what is the right thing for you. And the way that I look at things like work experience, internships, placements, is it's probably less about the content of work that you're going to be doing. Granted, that needs to be interesting, but most importantly, it's more about the environment that you're going to be working in that'll help you understand what type of job, what type of environment. Some people might look at massive companies. So companies like the Co-op, companies like huge kind of corporate organizations with really shiny products, really attractive packages, and that's suitable for them, because actually working in a large organization in an office environment is the right thing, but that's not right for everybody. Sometimes a smaller organization, that real fast changing pace of work, potentially maybe even being outside, can also come from work experience, understanding what you like and what you don't like, going back to that strengths piece as well.
And just to bring in Ellie quickly here, Ellie, because I just want to re-emphasize this point, because you've done the CAP strengths sessions, haven't you? And students have been using the CAP testing. We've still got some CAP tests available, so if students want to take that test, they can still do it. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we'll be talking about kind of the follow-up from today's session, and one of those is our student inbox. So I'd say if you've been on the session today, make sure you know, that's such a valuable resource afterwards. Email in afterwards, give us your name and that you're interested in the CAP strengths test, and we can help support you with that, because just like Danny said, it's really important to find roles which energize you. And I think it is about that energy, which when you've seen you're doing your research and you see kind of a job opportunity and you think that kind of gives you that motivation and energy to do a bit more research into it, we can really help support you there. But I think that's such a good point when you're doing that first stage in terms of research, is look for those ones that don't make you feel a bit exhausted and intimidated by the application process. Look for those ones which energize you and you really want to get started on the process.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So I think in summary of finding a job apprenticeship or course, I think it's about using all of the tools, all of the resources, all of the information you can get your hands on about an opportunity. It's about speaking to the right people who surround you. So that's your careers, teachers at schools, that's potentially your parents. Although do be mindful that it's an independent decision that you've got to make around your first career step, or that next step in your kind of career pathway. Consider everything. So too often do I see a lot of apprentices apply to opportunities in Manchester who live in Bristol, which for those who aren't familiar with geography is around about 4.5 hour drive each way. And the kind of the question I always ask is, do you know that you're applying to a position in Manchester? And too often do I see students not necessarily considering the factors around commuting, the factors around salary, and that's not about going for the job that pays the most sometimes, but actually, you know, if you work in a city, for argument, if you live outside of London and you have to commute into London, really factor in those travel costs, because they can have a big impact on your earning and your quality of life at the end of the day, which is the most important thing. I would think long term as well. So when you're searching for opportunities, don't just think, right, level 2, that's what I'm going to do next. What happens after that? What can that company offer me after a level 2? Is there a ladder for apprenticeships? If you're applying for a job, what does that progression route look like? If you're interested in travel, can that organization give you that global travel that you're looking for as such? And the last piece I would say is don't be a sheep. And what I mean by that is don't follow the crowd sometimes. So one of the things which not a lot of people know, when they think of co-op, they think of food shops, they think of funeral care potentially. But the reality is when you work in a retailer, you have hundreds of industries working within one organization. So you probably wouldn't think that the co-op has its own cybercrime team. You probably wouldn't think that we have our own events team and hospitality team. You probably wouldn't think that we have our own finance team and potentially our own accountancy team. Definitely most people don't believe that we have our own kind of ethics and sustainability team as such. So it's really about not necessarily thinking IT equals, for argument's sake, Microsoft, Dell, etc. Finance equals banks. Really think differently and broaden your horizons. And a little bit of a trick of the trade as such is you often have a better chance of getting an opportunity if you apply to a position in a less obvious company, should we say. Because if I'm interested in banking, probably around 80% of the students who are also interested in banking are applying to the same companies, which are usually banks or investment companies. But there's no reason why you couldn't apply to a retail bank, potentially, which would usually see a smaller number of applications. Or if it wasn't necessarily banking you were dead set on, but you were open to finance, apply to an organization which you wouldn't necessarily put finance in the same piece as such in terms of their brand, but they'll give you a great experience. They'll still give you an apprenticeship or a career pathway or a graduate scheme or whatever that might be. But you usually have a better chance of applying to the...
It's really good. And just picking up, Danny, because you did the apprenticeship masterclass last week, and just to re-emphasize that think broader, think into the future, that's the exact example you gave us, not just to look at that level 4 apprenticeship scheme and go, oh, is this for me? Or that level 3, actually going, well, no, but where could it go to and where could it progress to? Even beyond the apprenticeship, right? I think particularly teachers, students, parents, we get so obsessed with that's the level in front of me, but we need to be looking far wider, don't we, quite often?
Absolutely. And I think on that point as well, whilst I'm talking about, look beyond, look as much as you can in the future and work your way back. And I suppose my concluding point of today's session was, this is not, if you're looking into your first step out of education into the world of work, this is not the only decision you'll ever make about your career. So if you think, oh God, my friend Billy, he knows exactly what he wants to do for the next 10 years, and I don't have a clue, that's okay. That's absolutely fine. Yeah. Because actually, this isn't the only decision you make. And people think that careers go one way and that's straight and up. That doesn't happen anymore. Careers go left to right, up, down, left to right, all over the place. And that's how you gain experiences. And ultimately, to be perfectly frank, that's how you find yourself in jobs that you probably didn't aspire to do when you were a child. I never grew up wanting to be a recruitment manager. I didn't even know what recruitment was, to be honest. I always wanted to be an airline pilot. Long story, I won't go into it, but I never knew I would find my way here. But actually, from moving from jobs into different industries, you find what you're interested in, you find what your passions are, and gaining qualifications, gaining experience can only help push yourself into the right pathway that you're looking
Danny,
for.
I've done my research now. I know where I'm going. How does it start, the application process? What am I looking for?
Yeah, so number 2, understanding and nailing the application process. So one of the things which people sometimes forget to do, to be perfectly honest, when applying for a position is understanding and researching what that application process looks like for students. In a nutshell, most organizations, most universities who are recruiting or accepting applications for something will have a kind of a basic shell of a process. And that will include some sort of application. That could be online or it could be offline, although the trend at the moment is very much so online applications. They will have some sort of screening. And what I mean by screening is it's an assessment of applications before you get to the third and usually final stage of interviews as such. And that can take many different shapes and forms, which I'll come on to in a second. So it could be that you're applying to an apprenticeship, in which case you're applying effectively to a job in an organization. So you've got to apply direct to that business. And you can find yourself going through a number of different stages, which could include an application form. It could include online assessments. It could include a telephone interview, maybe a video interview, and usually some form of face-to-face assessment center or individual one-to-one interview. A job pretty much follows that pathway. You would usually find less apprenticeship specific questions, obviously in a just a general job application, and potentially if it's part-time, application processes are usually a little bit shorter as well. So usually apply and then potentially an interview as such. And if you're applying to a university course, you are needing to apply via UCAS, not directly to the university, submitting your personal statement, selecting universities, and potentially going to interviews in assessment centres. I'll share an interesting story about my own experience there. I just assumed that you chose your universities and you just turned up on the first day after you'd picked which one you wanted. It turns out it didn't work like that for me. So I was invited to what I thought was a thank you for choosing X university, and lo and behold, I turned up in very casual clothing, football top, kind of a pair of jeans and trainers. It was actually an assessment centre. Everyone else was there in suits, ties, shirts, smart clothing, pretty prepped, and that was probably one of the biggest learnings for me, is actually do your research about the selection process, and really when you are applying to university, treat it like a job application, not just a throwing your application and your hat into the ring as such. So top level then, those are the kind of the three core elements of a selection process. Before you even step foot into the process and click the apply button, one of the things which you really need to do is get ready to apply. So that's about doing your research on the opportunity, doing your research on the business, reading the job advert, which is something which not a lot of people seem to do, worryingly so. But probably the biggest piece of advice I would give you is almost do a dummy run of the application form. So if you can, go through the application form, don't submit anything, gather all of the questions that you're going to be asked and start to work on them offline. That might be copying and pasting it into a Word document. It could be actually just really mentally preparing yourself for the questions which come up there. The biggest one, understand whether you actually need to submit a CV. Too often do you see people spend hours and hours and hours on a CV, and then it turns out you don't even need one. So save yourself the time and check that out first. If you do need a CV, then naturally you need to be investing some time into writing the best CV you can. And the biggest tip I would give, without going into CVs too much, is make it relevant, because ultimately your CV has to match that of the job. The other thing I would probably suggest in the getting yourself ready to apply is actually creating the right environment for you to apply. So if you've got a lot going on over the weekend and you don't have the headspace to do it, don't apply for the job on the weekend. But whatever you do, try and do it as early as possible. Otherwise, if you save a job, guaranteed you'll miss the deadline, because it's not at the front of your mind. So just try and do it as early as possible, but do it at the right time for you, where you've got the headspace and a quiet space, where you've done your research on what you actually need to apply for the opportunity.
And Danny, just on that, that's almost the hardest part, I think, for students in year 12 and 13. I speak to so many students in year 12 who are like, I'm keen for some work experience schemes with national firms. Oh, these firms, they've all actually passed their deadlines already. And then, for example, apprenticeships. Oh, it's the 16th of January now. I've done my UCAS. I'm ready to look. Well, actually, the ones you were looking for, you've only got a week to apply. It's quite important in year 12 and 13 to be really knowledgeable about what's going on, right? It's quite hard.
Yeah, it's hard to keep up with it. And as well, it's not easy for me as a business to understand when all of those windows are in line with the market. So it's difficult for students to understand actually what's the right time for me to be looking, what's the right time for me to be applying. The only thing you can do is to keep your ear to the ground, do your research, identify those top 10, top 5 opportunities. And if it's not opportunities, think about those top 5 or 10 organizations that you want to apply for, and get ahead of the game as quickly as you can, so you know what those timelines are. If they're not listed on the website, reach out to the company, find out what's coming down the pipeline, and that could be an email to their recruitment team with a simple question of, when are you recruiting for apprentices? Or you'll usually find university applications are kind of set within the year, and that's usually within that kind of back end of kind of September, October, November, December, and then running into January. So that is pretty much set in the calendar as such, which year 13 should all be very much aware of. So next stage, so we've found the job. It's the best job you'll ever have, and it sounds so exciting, and you can't sleep because it's the one thing that you really want. You've done your research on the application form. You've seen what questions are coming up. You feel ready for it. So now's the time for you to set your application kind of going as such. So as I've said, review the form, get your questions, prepare any questions that you can in advance. So that sometimes comes in the shape of like a questionnaire. So it could be, tell me about a time when you've done X, Y, and Z. Try and get those questions before from the application form and complete it on a Word document. Refine it, and most importantly, remember that you will usually have a limited number of words to submit in the application form. So keep it really simple and keep it really relevant. And those are the 2 key things of any application form: simple and relevant. If you're a large organization recruiting for apprentices or graduates, chances are you're probably going to be recruiting for a lot of people. Therefore, a lot of applicants means less time to read every single application, unfortunately. If you're a smaller organization, the chances are you don't have the time to read every single application, because you're probably doing everything as well as running the business, as well as marketing, as well as legal and everything that comes around that. So the quicker you can get to the point of your application, the quicker you can make it relevant, the more chance you've got of actually being kind of brought to the forefront of the recruiter's mind, and therefore getting through that initial application.
Danny, what about AI in application forms? Do big companies just use computers to look through things? How does it kind of work? Is that real?
It's about as real as hoverboards. Does it exist? Yes, it does exist. Do people use them? Yes. Are they widely used? No, not really. Right. There's a lot of questions at the moment around AI, so it's a fantastic piece of technology, and that's for people who aren't familiar with the abbreviation. It's artificial intelligence, so a computer effectively reading words in an application and saying that person is right and that person isn't right. There's a lot of questions around that at the moment from a legal perspective and a data perspective, but it is used, but not really on the whole, to be perfectly honest. It usually is, I suppose, a trick of the trade is there are some questions that you'll usually find in the application form, which are what we call in the recruitment business killer questions or screening questions, and they are usually yes or no answers. Read them as best you can, understand the question, because sometimes they seem really simple, but actually what they're asking you might not be what you think. It could come down to, for example, if you read a question which says, are you over the age of 18? Because the job might need you to be 18 to apply to it for whatever reason, and you tick no, then your application is likely to not even be looked at. But actually, you are over 18, you just read the question incorrectly. Well, that's your chance gone in terms of that opportunity potentially. So just be mindful of those real kind of simple yes or no answers. They sound really simple, but they have a massive bearing on your initial application as such. Okay. And I think the last thing I would probably say around your application form would really be around making sure that you are focused in your applications. So quality is far better than quantity, and that stems from your research, making sure you've got the right kind of jobs and the companies that you're looking for, but focus definitely on those kind of companies that you really want, because that will come through in your application.
And Danny, just before we move on to the exciting stuff about online video interviews, etc., Ellie's just asked, in regard to making your CV relevant, personally, I know I don't have work experience that links to what I want to go into. So do I include the experience, or do I include the experience I do have on the CV, or just focus on general skills?
Both, to be honest. So I would say every experience that you have there are learnings to take from them. Companies are not looking for, if we're looking at people who are coming out of school or college, I'm not looking for someone who can walk in tomorrow and be our new CEO, because that's not going to happen. And that's okay, because that's why we're recruiting people into our business on apprenticeships, on graduate programs, etc. So any experience that you've got, I would say, is relevant, because actually, as long as there's skills that you've learned, as long as there's a positive outcome of that experience, then yeah, share that with the employer, as well as those general skills. And I would say with general skills, don't just create a list of everything that you can ever do. I can fry an egg, I can use a PowerPoint document. Make those skills really relevant if you can.
Great, thank you. Right, online test, Danny.
Yeah, so onto the exciting stuff. So online tests, a lot of people dread them. It'd be really good to get your thoughts in the chat box around whether you have done an online test, what your thoughts were. But the most important thing I would say about an online test is there are so many different types that you can do. Sometimes it's actually really difficult as a candidate, and I've been there myself. It's actually really difficult as a candidate to get perfection in them all, to be perfectly honest, because the reality is not every single online test is out of 10. It's not a marked test, because there are two key different types of tests. You've got aptitude, which means, can you do something? Do you have a level of knowledge or a level of skill in a specific subject? To bring that to life, what we use in the co-op for our apprentices is functional skills. So we're testing people's maths and English. In those tests, there is a benchmark. You are either you're a pass or you're a fail. Those are those aptitude tests. They'll give you a really good, as an employer, a really good picture. Can someone do the job that you're asking them to do in the right way? That could come through numerical reasoning. So you might have heard of them before. You might have heard of verbal reasoning, or logical, or abstract, or diagrammatical. Those three things are the same thing. One of the key parts around aptitude tests is around practice. You will never know exactly what questions are going to come through. Most online tests probably pull from a bank of 10,000 questions. So every candidate that does the test will do a different test, but it's benchmarked at the same level. The only way, in my experience, that you can really tune into the test and put yourself in the best position to pass it as such is to practice. And that's practicing potentially old examination papers, that's practicing on practice tests and getting a feel for what it looks like. And before, Chris, I know you've probably got a few questions in there. Just wanted to highlight the differences between the benchmarks. So numerical reasoning is not necessarily, there's 30 questions and you've got to get 30 of them right. It's about how quick do you process information and input an answer into that test. So you don't have to be a mathematical genius to pass a numerical reasoning test. Your brain has to work in a logical way. And that is what we call intellect. The other piece is a hard and fast benchmark. So that is, we've got 10 questions, and to pass that, you need 7 out of 10. That is how clever somebody is, and therefore you need to brush upon your mental maths or your language or your spelling or whatever that might be. So just bear in mind that there are 2 different types of aptitude tests out there.
Okay, good stuff. I've just got a couple of questions here. How do you find practice tests? PJ Daly's never done one. Guys, we do actually have them on the resources section of our website. So again, at the end of this webinar, email into student@Pathway and we can send you some. Danny, any advice if you want to use Pathway? Any ones that you know about maybe?
You've got SHL, use exam papers, so GCSE exam papers, AQA, Edexcel, OCR, all have exam papers on there. They can give you a really good idea as to the kind of questions that might come up in a test. But again, as I mentioned, it's a massive library of questions, which everyone has a different test as such.
And we've got Karishma saying, I like the psychometric ones and the numerical ones, but I don't have, I've done a game version once, which was quite strange and rather difficult. Gamification, Danny, is that something that the co-op use, or do you know about it?
Yes, we don't use it here, but it is something which is growing as a trend in the market. Gamification and some tests actually amalgamate everything together. So personality tests and your personality profile and values and behaviors, as well as aptitude in terms of reasoning or actual kind of hard and fast maths and English, etc., etc.
Guys, go on, Danny.
Gamification is really interesting though, because it's a very different way of assessing candidates, and actually I find quite exciting as an opportunity, because they give you a test without really knowing, because you're actually so engrossed in a simulation or a game. It can really break up the kind of the vanilla tests that you usually get in the market.
It's interesting, guys. A lot of companies do it, like Deloitte do it, for example. I think Firefly is one of the games, and we've got free access for you guys to have a little practice on that, just so that Students Through Pathway can have a go at it. It's really interesting, Danny. Like, you've got to play a game. It's like playing a game, but then they measure your element of risk. You've got 10 coins. Do you want to go for 11, or are you happy with 10 and move on to the next level? And then obviously that's their way of trying to find through technology the right sort of people for their organization, right?
Yeah, so if we take that example for argument's sake, I don't work for Deloitte. I don't understand what they're kind of looking for in the background, but that sounds to me like that's actually looking at not how risky are you in the kind of very kind of monetary sense or the very transactional sense, but actually it's looking for your courage, that kind of real personality potential, that kind of real behavior that you might show as a candidate, to match up with their kind of profile of what they're actually looking for. And Hamza Bash has kind of said that done a couple of online tests for different companies while looking for part-time jobs. They can be very confusing. I would agree. There are some out there which are quite worded interestingly, I would put, and quite confusing for a lot of candidates. And the possibility for you to pass them can be really low. What I would say is, whilst it might feel that way, because maybe they're saying you've got 30 questions and you've got 20 minutes to answer them, you kind of go, how am I going to do that? Actually, that's what you call a reasoning test, not a you need to complete all the answers and get them all right. So don't be kind of going into online testing thinking, oh, the possibility to pass them is really low, because to be perfectly honest, unless you work in the recruitment team, you don't know what the pass rate looks like. We have tests where actually you only need to get 30% on them to pass. Wow. Whereas some tests you need 80% on them to pass. So it can really differ.
It's just all about practice, guys. All about practice.
Practice. Okay, so that's so online tests. Just quickly on that one, you do have your personality profiles. The biggest piece of advice I could give you on this is be yourself. Do not try and be somebody or pretend that you are somebody that you think the company wants. You've got to be true to yourself, because to be perfectly honest, if you answer some questions as you and true to you, and you answer some questions which you think that I want to hear that, or you think that you should be that, you can tell them in a report and a score, and actually it becomes very obvious to those candidates who aren't necessarily right for our business. And the other thing I would say is on personality profiles is wherever you can, get the results and get some feedback from the business on those tests, purely because they can be really helpful to your self-awareness and actually helping you understand what is right for me and what type of jobs might I look to go into. And using that insight to develop yourself can be really, really valuable.
Great. And Danny, I'm conscious of time and what we want to get through. So let's keep going.
Yeah, okay. So telephone interviews and video interviews. Telephone is what people say. Old school, video is new school as such. Telephone interviews and video interviews should be approached in the same way you would approach a face-to-face interview, as if you were going to meet the hiring manager yourself. A telephone interview is, as it says on the tin, someone will call you up or you'll be invited to dial into a call, and they will effectively ask you a number of questions over the phone, which can be positioned as competency. So that could be, tell me about a time when. It could be behavioral, which essentially means it puts you in a simulated scenario. So if this happened, how would you react? And it could actually be some really basic questions like, do you actually know you're applying to this job? Do you know where it is? How are you going to get to work? So it can really take different forms. But there's no real difference apart from the video piece, which obviously looks and feels a little bit like this potentially now. There's no real difference in the questions that you're going to ask in a video interview. One of the biggest tips I would give you is, in a telephone interview, you're going to be speaking to me or a member of my team who effectively will be able to probe you, so ask you follow-up questions. In a video interview, you can't do that unless it's a live video interview, which is unusual, to be honest. They're usually pre-recorded. So the questions that you might get in a video interview will be very much skill-based, very much probably more based upon reality than they would be on a hypothetical situation, because you can't probe as a recruiter. Therefore, you can't get the best out of the candidate sometimes if you were to ask the wrong question. So with a telephone and a video interview, they serve a purpose. Telephone interviews are very much still the theme, and very much widely used, although video interviews are very much starting to kind of become on the incline in terms of a selection tool. But don't be nervous. It can be it might sound really weird to sit in front of a laptop with no one else on the other end of it, in front of a webcam where you can see yourself, but you can't see the person who's sitting on the end of that. Most of the time, if not all of the time, when doing a video interview, unless it's live, there is nobody sat on the other end of that in that moment. It's pre-recorded and it's picked up by someone in the recruitment team further down the line. But I would always recommend you to look at it as if you're taking a selfie. Maybe think about your background and your attire a little bit more, but pretty much I would reckon everyone in this panel today, this participant group, has taken a selfie at some point. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. You're just answering questions which are on a screen. which you need to think about, you need to prepare for in the right way, as you would for a face-to-face interview. But look at it in that light, rather than it being this really daunting, kind of intimidating webcam session as such.
And guys, please remember that there's one company I know of, and there's a few similar, where 20% of their applications drop out at video interview stage.
Yep.
They don't even try, right? Because they're obviously scared of maybe how they look, or they haven't done it before. Don't be that person, because it doesn't matter how you look, does it, Danny? You don't have to be putting on makeup or anything like that for your video interviews. It's not how you would go to a meeting, is it?
Not really, but I would always recommend you to treat it as an interview. So if you can, dress smartly. And that's not because, oh God, an employer's going to be sat there looking at the wallpaper and thinking, that's not the kind of person I want. That's not how it works. But interestingly so, by dressing smartly, it changes your mental attitude towards that interview, and you take it more seriously. And it's that kind of small tweaks that you can make to really make it an impactful interview.
Another piece of, Danny, just another piece of advice there, just to jump in while we're talking about those video interviews, is in one of our masterclasses recently, one of the employers we work with said, which I thought was a really good point, is when you're thinking of an answer, usually I'm doing it now, I'm talking and I think, and I look up to this guy, and that's fine, and that's a normal way of talking. There's literally nothing to stop you students from having some notes up about the company, the key business values up behind your laptop, behind wherever you're doing the video interview, just as triggers, because it's not reciting it off the wall. Danny, you know that it just shows that preparation. I think it's a really nice way of kind of having those little triggers to remind yourself what you want to be getting across in the video interviews, albeit that you might have those little reminders in front of you. Take advantage of the fact that you are at home, or you are in the place you feel comfortable with, for these video interviews. I think that was good. That was maybe to add on to your point.
Yeah, absolutely. Would agree. Take advantage of the situation. There's no one saying you can't take your notes into your living room.
No.
So take them into your living room and put them on the wall. Okay, conscious of time, and we'll come. I'll try and whiz through the next two sections.
Cool.
Around.
And then we'll come to some questions, and then we'll go on to top tips. Great.
Yeah, for certain. So interviews and assessment centres. This is usually the final stage of the selection process. So it could be this is an interview for a course at university, in which case it is usually with the course leader, as such, or one of the tutors. Or admissions teams, or it could actually be applying to an apprenticeship or a job, and therefore that's usually with the recruitment team or the hiring manager within the business who you are likely to be working for. So an interview, for those of you who don't know, is essentially an assessed conversation. In a very simple phrase, it's an assessed conversation, and what we would be looking for as an employer is for you to bring your personality, for you to bring your interests, your experiences, wherever they might have come from, to the interview, and talk about them aligned to a number of questions that we would have set up, and it can range from half an hour to potentially a couple of hours for a face-to-face interview. Any recruiter which tells you just to try and be natural, how can you be natural in a situation when you're being assessed for talking in front of somebody on the other side of the table? It's not a natural situation. So just don't think that going into an interview being nervous is a bad thing, because actually that's normal. But what you should try and do in an interview is bring yourself. So bring that personality out, bring that real desire for the opportunity. Don't be fake, be real to yourself. And use the preparation guides which companies would usually send out before an interview. Read through those and use similar types of language that they might use as an organization, because if you start talking like a company, it helps an assessor actually picture you in that role, in that team, in that business. Assessment centres are again interesting concepts. So usually full day or half day events where you would spend time in an organisation and you would experience a number of different experiences and assessments throughout that event. Usually formulated of an interview, a one-on-one interview, a group scenario, and potentially another activity, which could be a practical assessment, it could be a case study or an individual exercise. And what businesses are looking for in assessment centres is probably up to eight to 10 different elements, really. And that can range from what you can bring to the role, to your experiences and potentially skills, if that's what the company's looking for. But also, and probably quite crucially, companies wouldn't hold an assessment centre usually unless they wanted to see how people work together as a team. And that's where that group exercise comes into it. And I just wanted to focus on that a little bit, conscious of time. I just wanted to focus on that a little bit, because actually one of the biggest things in a group exercise is people are told never be the scribe. People are told never take the lead, potentially. There's nothing wrong with being the scribe, so taking notes for the team, as long as you don't just become enthralled in writing. There's nothing wrong with you taking the lead, as long as you're not arrogant and overpowering, because there's a real fine line between those two. So make sure you stay on the side and bring other candidates, bring other people in the room, because whilst you are competing as such for the job, you ultimately need to show a business that you can work with other people, because that's exactly what you're going to be doing day in, day out. So bringing other people into conversation, supporting people who maybe aren't as confident in a group scenario, bring them into that conversation. And I think the one thing I would say is, if you aren't necessarily overly kind of extrovert, or you aren't necessarily the first person to speak up in a conversation, that's sometimes not a bad thing. And actually, I would probably suggest that that's not a bad thing at any time, because reality is a lot of people behave in different ways. It is really critical to the success of any team that you have a balance of people. If you had a lot of people in a room who were just like really loud and really action focused and really kind of, I want to get to the end result, I am the leader of this group, you'd never get anything done. And that's why having individuals in the group who bring different personality traits, who bring different ways of working, can really help add value to the exercise. And importantly, remember that if you are ever asked to do a presentation at the end, make sure that you plan it before your time is up, and make sure that every individual, including yourself, has a part to play in that presentation.
You've got to speak, haven't you? You've got to say something.
You've got to speak. Yeah. And sometimes, I would always encourage companies not to assess that presentation. And we at the Co-op don't assess presentations at the end. It's actually just used to round off the exercise, so it's not just left on a cliff edge. But some companies do assess that presentation, so just make sure that you're mindful of that.
Fantastic. Okay, Danny, then I suppose we'll be able to just quickly touch on getting the offer. What do we mean by this? Why is this on the slide?
Yeah, so last thing I think for me is really critical is you've done the assessment centre, it's the dream job, you get a call the day after and the recruiter says, you've got the job, can you make a decision now? Just bear in mind that you don't have to make that decision there and then. It is really important that you do your research, you understand if it's the right job, you go through that process, and at the same time as the company assessing you, you assess them. Make sure that you're the right fit. The people that are assessing you, are they speaking in the right way? Do you feel like a part of that already? Because when you get to the offer, this is you signing on that dotted line. And the one thing I cannot ask enough of candidates is just make sure this is the right thing for you before you sign that dotted line in that contract. If we do send you a contract, or if a company does send you a contract, read it through, make sure you're comfortable with everything in there. If you don't understand everything in there, speak to the company, speak to your parents potentially, or guardians, and just make sure that you're happy with everything that's on the table. Bear in mind, one thing I would always encourage is that there's nothing wrong about talking about salary at the same time, but just bear in mind that a lot of entry-level positions have a very fixed salary, so there isn't usually a flex for a business to go up in that as such. And I think finally, just on that getting the offer piece, is just be open with an employer. That's it. Just be open. If you've got 3 offers on the table from 3 different companies and you're really not sure, pick up the phone to the companies, because it's in their best interest to support you through that process. If it's a decision between college and apprenticeship or university and apprenticeship, have that conversation with the employer, because there is absolutely nothing worse and expensive as getting all the way to August the 31st. Your program starts on the 1st of September, and 50% of people don't turn up because they've actually chosen to go to university, but they didn't tell you. It's quite rude, to be honest, but it costs businesses a lot of money. And actually, at that point in time, we can't then fill those potential opportunities because we don't have the time to do so. So have those open conversations and be honest with employers.
So Ellie and I are going to ask just a couple of questions from the Q&A box. Guys, by the way, look, I think we're going to have 10 more minutes on this session. So we're up to the hour, but it is good content. So hopefully at the minute, everyone's sticking with us. So well done. Hopefully we're not too busy or places to go at the moment. Danny, I just want to say, any advice for dealing with rejection of an application? How would you deal with rejection if you got rejected, Danny?
Get feedback. Number one, ask for feedback. Be realistic that sometimes not every company can give you that. Wrongly, in my opinion, but it's about being realistic. I would suggest that you be realistic with yourself. You know, I never met anybody who's applied for every job and got every job, because that's not how everything works. And actually, every experience that you get, be that through a selection process or actually be that through rejection, can help you learn a lot about yourself. So take it as a learning experience. It can be really hard actually when you don't get what you want. And if you've got your heart set on something, it can be a real crusher if you don't get it. But just be mindful that for every one dream job or opportunity you think that there is, there's probably another 10 out there. You've just got to go and find them.
Yeah, good suggestion. Thanks, Danny.
And on that, I guess it's reminding back to your point earlier, which was that people's careers aren't a straight line and you can go in various different directions. So rejection is actually a really positive learning experience. Mark, a great question, and congratulations on having an interview next week. But Danny, can you give us maybe an example of maybe one generic competency question that sometimes is asked in interviews? Do you have any off the top of your head that you think would be asked?
Yeah, so it could be. I'm not sure about the job, and that's a big tailoring factor of questions, but it could be, for example, a competency question would sound like, could you tell me about a time when you have worked as part of a team? So draw from your experiences, draw from working at school, college, if you're part of a sports team, working with siblings, whatever that might be, draw from those experiences.
No, good stuff, Danny. One from me. I have a question. Do they assess you on the overall performance of the application, or is the job assessed on you passing the online test? It's everything, isn't it, Danny? They're all put in for a reason.
Everything. Yeah, everything can be in there. Sometimes it can be a deciding factor who scores the highest if there's 10 jobs and there's 11 candidates, but that's unlikely. It's usually in that case, it would usually be done by every factor in there, primarily based upon the interview if you're going to base it on anything.
Great. And Ellie, this might be a good one for you. What are some strength-based questions? Do you know any from the CAP example, I wonder? Putting you on the spot here.
Yes. So in terms of strengths-based questions, I guess maybe Danny is one which is better for you. But in terms of strengths, I guess the point that I was making earlier around strengths is answering them in terms of what energizes you and focusing on those things that you know actually do energize you, and not pigeonholing yourself. So for example, if you love communication, don't only apply to roles which are associated with communication, because those strengths will be applicable to lots of different roles across lots of different companies, is how I'd summarize strengths. But maybe a question would be
well, a good example on that actually, Ellie, and how you're speaking about it is a good example. One question that's really out the blue is, what's your favorite day of the week and why? Because what they want to see from you there is, well, I love Tuesdays, and I love Tuesdays because I go out and I do my rugby kicking because I'm a rugby player. And I just absolutely love it. I train all the time for it, and I'm talking about what makes me passionate and what I'm good at. So that's quite interesting. Strength is a little bit different from the more standardized competency-based questions.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a big fan of, if you were a superhero, who would you be? If you were a bird, what would you be? I'm not a very big fan of those, but some companies do use them.
Not in Danny's interview. Here we go. You know the Firefly SHL or what platform? Yeah, people are asking about the different tests opportunities. So we will send you guys on the email follow-up the recording of this and also some practice tests there. Danny, I'm just conscious of time. Should we crack on with your top tips?
Yep, sounds good. So finding an opportunity, start with an open mind, which is don't be a sheep. do your research, not just money, not just company, but how are you going to get there, etc., and only apply for those you really, really want. Don't waste your time and don't waste the employer's time applying for something you don't really care about. Applying for the position. So prepare and invest in your application. Do your research, prep ahead, really buy into it, buy into the company, buy into what the assessment looks like, which leads on to practice. Point number 2, get as much practice in as you can. Mock interviews with your family, with your friends, with some people who can give you some feedback as well. So that could be teachers, it can be your careers leaders as well. And third, and probably the most important one for me, is always about being yourself. Always be true to yourself, because if you are, as you go through that process, don't tell a company what you think they want to hear. Tell them what you want to tell them, and just be true to yourself, because it's that kind of selection process which will really benefit you. And when you come to getting the offer, you will sign the line because you are absolutely 100% confident that and maybe those opportunities are the right things for you. Just one thing on the practice I forgot to mention is to use the STAR method in both telephone, in video, and face-to-face interviews. So that's set the scene in when answering a question. So that's S for situation, set the scene. That's T for task. So what were you asked to do? That's action. So that's A for action. What did you do? So what action did you take? And you, particularly, I don't want to hear about we. I want to talk about you. And then the final R stands for results. So what happened in the end? And most importantly, always talk about what you've learned from that experience, from that situation. So the STAR, STAR methodology is probably one of the best ways you can prepare for an interview.
Fantastic.
And then getting the offer, my screen's in the way. Make a considered final decision. Don't feel pressurized, and be open and honest with employers. All 3 of those things are really critical for you to sign that kind of final agreement and make sure that you're happy with what's on the table. And I've mentioned it earlier on in the session. Applying for jobs, recruitment is a cycle that people will go over probably 20 to 30 times in their working life. That doesn't mean they've got 20 to 30 different jobs, because the chances are they've probably only got 10 of those. So be prepared for not getting everything you apply for. But just remember that for every experience that you take, there are learnings, there are feedback, there is self-development you can gain from those applications, from that recruitment process. But don't ever put pressure on yourself to get everything you apply for, because if I'm being perfectly honest and being realistic, you're probably setting yourself up for disappointment. And I'm not being negative there. I'm trying to be realistic.
I mean, Ellie, you were saying earlier, you got some rejections, didn't you, from your graduate applications?
Yeah, I've not to shout about it, but I've been rejected multiple times for multiple things. But I think that also one piece of advice there is, if you apply to 1 million jobs, you can only actually do one of them. So all you need is one offer. So all the other rejections are just kind of stepping stones to where I am today. So I don't see any of them as negative. I see them all as experience, really. But I've spoken to, hence in the interview for this job, I've definitely spoken about some of them. So yeah,
definitely. You know, Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks, got rejected for funding 150 times. Now, there's countless of examples about rejection. You know, you don't become successful by doing it the first time. You become successful from learning from all your failures and your mistakes. So that's why if you're in year 12 or 13, even if you're dead set on going to university, I always say this to young people: apply for an apprenticeship, have a go. If you're set on going to do economics at Brunel, why wouldn't you have a go at applying for a few different brands beforehand and get the practice in? You know, you could always turn down the employer if need be, or pull out the application if you need to. But you know, maybe have a go and research things and practice. Danny, I've just got a question here. What would be your number 1 top tip for any job interview? Good question, Callum.
Number 1 top tip would be yourself. Because you can come out of that interview then and think, I did my best today. I was me. And if they don't like me, then they don't like me. Because actually, why should you change your personality? Why should you change who you are for an organisation as such?
Brilliant.
So be yourself always.
No, I love it. And we've just got a few questions here to go through, guys. How can you stand out in a group interview?
How can you stand out in a group interview? Don't overpower. Communicate with everybody in the group. Give people time to give their own answers and bring other people in the group, and show those leadership skills, which are around bringing people into the conversation. It's around supporting other people in that group, and leading on things like, communicating or writing or whatever that might be. It's a little bit of jack of all trades, I think the right phrase to use there in a group exercise. But the one thing I would definitely recommend you not to do, and if you think you're inclined to do this potentially, is do never talk over people, because it shows a sign of arrogance and disrespect, which employers will tune into immediately and turn off.
Danny, I'm going to do 2 more points because I've just realised, Eddie's reminded me, we've got a webinar coming up at 3:30 we need to log on for.
Okay.
Mark Jones, by the way, the guy who had the competency-based question, he's interviewing for an engineering degree level apprenticeship at Airbus.
Wow.
That's pretty cool, isn't it, Mark?
That's really cool.
Mark, let us know how you get on. Do drop us an email and let us know. And also, if you need any more support, drop us an email and we can go through some questions with you and help you practice. How do you answer the question, Danny? Tell me about yourself.
Keep it short,
Yeah.
Keep it straightforward, and make it relevant. So don't tell them about how many fish you've got if you're not applying for a job in a pet store, and make it see it as the opportunity for you to really sell yourself, because the rest of the interview is likely to be very structured answers. So talk about what you're passionate in, talk about what you enjoy to do outside of work, as well as potentially any experiences you've had. Yeah.
Brilliant. And one more question, guys, please do put in the chat box anything that you've learned from this session. I'm so impressed, by the way. Danny, what does it say about a person who's on a webinar during Easter holidays who stays on for over an hour?
It's amazing.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Would you be doing it at 17?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's great. It's great to see that, and particularly, businesses acknowledge how challenging the circumstances currently are for students, and people looking for their first career, and to be focused and to be committed at this time of the year can only be a good thing, and really positive towards your prospects in the future, which is fab.
Fantastic. And just really want to get this in because Karishma comes on lots of these sessions. Are group interviews and assessment centres the same thing? Good question. Because the group interview would happen at the assessment centre, right?
Not necessarily. So some companies do refer to group interviews as assessment centres and vice versa. Some people do talk about panel interviews and group interviews in the same way. They are very different things. A group interview is a very old school type of interview where there is a number of candidates in the room and it's kind of firing 1 or 2 questions to each candidate. They're very much going out of the kind of the window at the moment. So when I would assume, it depends on the terminology from every company, but most organizations would refer to an assessment center as a group interview. If they do, it's unlikely they would actually use the old type of group interviewing, which is frowned upon a little bit, to be honest.
Brilliant. Guys, I'll put the survey, please, in the chat box. If you would just spend a couple of minutes going through that. I think it's been an awesome session with Danny again. And we're back again next week with Science in Retail, Danny, which is going to be an exciting one. We haven't got too much time to go over that now, but just top line, if you're going to say why to tune in next week.
So we have Ian Ferguson, who's our food policy manager, the genius behind the compostable carrier bag, which is an unbelievable invention, massively helpful to the global crisis around plastics, and developed here at Co-op. And he'll be talking about his career in science, in food policy at Co-op, and giving some really helpful and really interesting stories really around his experience in his career. So tune in for that next week at same time.
Brilliant. And guys, as you know, email student@pathwayctm if you need to follow up with anything. We're going to give you the recording and we're going to give you the SHL, the CAP testing and the Firefly password as well. So thanks very much, Danny. Thanks so much. And we'll see you again next week.
Thank you very much. See you soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Ellie.
Bye.